must be evident I am not Jemima Kish, who has a bad cold. So I'm here doing this great session, which is who are we on the web? It's about our identity, about who we pretend to be, about our privacy, about our children, about our relationships. So a big broad brushstroke in half an hour. And so can I introduce my panel, who've on my right here is Jamie Bartlett, author of a wonderful book, which I recommend, called The Dark Net, which is the exploration of the furthest, most grim recesses of the internet. Quite an extraordinary book. I really do recommend it. And he is the director of the Center for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos. Then we have Cory, who we've already met today, science fiction writer, campaigner, general know-it-all, very good man. Beeban Kidron, the film and documentary maker, whose film In Real Life, I think it's called, is that right? Journeys from the bedrooms of British teenagers to Silicon Valley, examining the internet's often pernicious effects on children. And here, in this beautiful coat, is Beth Noveck, founder of the White House Open Government Initiative, professor and author of Smart Citizens, Smart State, to be published in November this year. So let's start with this. It's my contention, and I think a lot of people's contention, that the web has changed us profoundly in just 25 years. Could you start on that, Jamie? Do you agree with that?
I think it's changed certain people, and it changes people in very different ways. It's easy to make a sweeping generalization, especially that people are nastier or meaner, crueler when they're online. And the truth is, any way that we communicate, any means we use to communicate, changes slightly the incentives we have and the behavior that we undertake. And that's certainly true of the web. My contention is that there are a small number of people who, under those conditions of being behind the screen, distant from the people that they're speaking to, do engage in quite different types of behavior. They see a difference in their online and their offline personalities, often for the worse, or they see very different types of, I suppose, morality operating online and off, but they keep those two identities separate. And then there's a smaller group within that for whom their online identity starts encroaching into their offline world. And it fundamentally changes what they think, what they do, and what they believe.
So a kind of neurological change. I mean, a profound change of character.
Yes, for some people.
Beeban, would you agree with that?
Yes, but I think there's something that we always miss out, which is that we behave in different circumstances very differently. You know, it's about what circle of what environment we're in. And the question is always for me, and because my interest is in particular young people, is what is the aggregated self? And who is in charge of that aggregated self? And and are there formal ways in which your behavior is dictated or nudged or pushed that are structural above and beyond? So, I think the best way that I have of describing it is, do you, as a young person, do you want yourself, your immediate family, your immediate friends, your school to determine your reflection, or do you want some corporation to determine your reflection? I think that's the area I'm interested in, and that's the nuance of who you are that we must get to.
Beth, you come from America, so do you think there's any sort of profound truth you can bring to us from America about this lack, or do you think there is a change in people? Do you think we've changed in the last 25 years?
Of course we've changed. The point is, however, it's not about whether the internet by itself has altered our genes, has altered our DNA in some way. What it does is it's a tool that allows us to express ourselves. It's an outlet. So for the narcissists who look into the lake and see themselves and then go and post a lot of pictures on Instagram, it's one thing. But it also allows us to look into that same lake, into the data lake, if you will, and see reflected back to us what we can do and what we know. And that allows us to use these tools to do a lot of good in the world at the same time. So just as we are, on the one hand, focusing on the web and the net as an outlet for narcissism and inward gazing, we also need to think about what it allows us to do when we're outward facing. So down the street, for example, there's a man named Mark Wilson. He's a neurosurgeon. He works for the London Ambulance Corps. And what Mark says is that sitting next to you in the audience, probably, somewhere next to you here, there is a paramedic, there is a nurse, there's a doctor, there's somebody with CPR training. So you know what he's doing? He's putting all those people on a network. He started this year, he's got 5,000 registered medical professionals signed up. And what he can do is that when somebody then has a trauma or an accident, they can rush to the aid of somebody who's nearby and perform CPR. They can give them aid and assistance faster than the traditional ambulance could get to them. And he's bringing this peer-to-peer service to the London Air Ambulance Corps in order to increase and improve the ability to deliver medical services to people. So what it does for us as individuals, it allows us to do good in the world, to express what we know and to have an outlet for doing good. And for society, it allows us to tap that potential and I think to tap that expertise in ways that we haven't been able to do before when we have relied only on traditional institutions.
It's a fascinating story, that. Cory, what do you think? We talked on the phone the other day. You seem to think that actually it would simply amplifies people's behavior. There are already people out there who are unpleasant. Is that right?
Well, I mean, I think it's true that, you know, you can sometimes be convinced that the person opposite you on the internet would never say such a terrible thing if they were face-to-face to you. But in my experience, I found that oftentimes you get face-to-face to them and they say exactly the same sort of unpleasant thing. So I think we've been oversold networked disinhibition, but also that we have a regression to the mean in extreme networked behaviors, that when you have a new tool come along, people will rush to it and find it engaging and interesting, in part by dint of its novelty, not because of what it does, but because it's never been done before. And then over time, for a huge slice of the population, it ceases to have that sort of really compelling nature. So think about, you know, the moral panic over Farmville, when it appeared that, like, playing Skinner box games were going to destroy our society by sucking up all of our human hours. And what it turned out, as you look at what's happened to Zynga's share price and user engagement, is that for huge tranches of people, Farmville was briefly interesting. In the same way that if you go back 150 years and look at advertising, it turns out that 150 years ago, you could sell a lot of soap with a banner that said, "Buy our soap and you will be clean." And people became inured to it. They regressed to the mean. And so I think that we often mistake that first blush with a long-term effect. We are drawn to things that let us cooperate with one another, because that's the project of our species, right? We started down our path diverging from our hominid ancestors when we began to labor collectively. We put a lot of energy into managing our social relationships, not because we're narcissists and not because we're shallow, but because the only way you can do something that transcends one human's capability, the only way you can do something superhuman, is by working with other people. And to do that, you have to keep track of other people as well. And so it's natural that if you offer people a service that gives them a bunch of social information, they'll engage with it deeply. And the problem isn't engaging deeply with social information about your colleagues and peers and the people around you. The problem is that when it's commodified and it's gained by a firm that wants not to help you maximize your happiness, but rather put you in a Skinner box designed to teach you to undervalue your privacy, that things turn out badly.
You can say.
Well, I think that I'm sort of very worried now that I'll never come. Okay, here I am. The debate on this usually comes down to net enthusiasts saying it's just a reflection of what we do offline.
Right.
And then the other side saying, no, it's making us nasty. But I think that just it being a reflection doesn't quite capture what's happening here. Because, as I said, there are many people who find certain types of negative behavior far easier to do online than they would offline. And everything we know about bad behavior, whether it's accessing illegal pornography, consuming drugs, whatever it is, if it's easier to do, there's going to be a slice of people who are going to do it that wouldn't otherwise have done so offline. And that is, I think, what's happening.
But also, your book, you have really horrific journey into the dark net. And there are people doing things who would never have done those things before. I mean, particularly the pornography sites and the women who make money in their little bedrooms doing everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a kind of horrible solipsistic world which wouldn't have been possible before, surely.
It wouldn't have been possible, or it would have been far harder. And there are certainly a lot of people who access illegal pornography who, I think, had it not been that easy for them to find it, and unfortunately it is far too easy to access this stuff, would not have got sucked into that world.
Right.
And then that fundamentally starts changing who they are. And The other side of this is how easily you can become inured to this sort of thing. So when I spent a huge amount of time in pro-anorexia and pro-suicide forums, I started off being shocked. 2 days later, it didn't surprise me at all. Yeah. And that is another great problem, because once you start becoming a nerd to things, you can very quickly lose your moral compass.
What do you feel about that, Beeban? Because, I mean, you've studied kids who have been seriously affected by the web, and not just the exposure to pornography, the idea they've got to be a brand.
No, I think that, I mean, on the kid thing, one of the things that I have found really sort of upsetting is that the last thing that they develop is a sense of consequence. So the idea that they are acting in the present tense and that they should imagine how that might be in the future is a very problematic thing. It's like literally they do not have the synapses ready until they're in their mid-20s. I think what's difficult about this subject is we always end up with it's good, it's bad. Of course it's both. It is, you know, it makes it extreme. And I think that what you have to we just have to ask, is it neutral? And I think that everybody would agree it's not neutral. And so in what ways does the neutrality push behaviour? Because my favourite thing at the moment is the pool party video from Texas. I'm sure everybody's seen it with the policeman and so on and so on. Imagine having an identity as a black kid in Texas and then suddenly feeling the power of taking on that authority and getting rid of that guy, which is something that you can't do. That's a positive, of course it is, but that doesn't mean that kids who are actually in another context are not suffering. So it's not a good, bad, it's both, and it's not neutral. How do we deal with that?
The other thing I was wondering is that two women here, do you think that women have prospered on the web? In the first session we touched on this, that it might have been a sort of engineered male world, and that vast numbers of programmers, coders, and designers are all male. Do you think is it skewed against women, or do you think we can change so that it is equal and more balanced and fair?
I'm tempted to make a joke as a female scientist on the panel. I'm tempted to start crying, as I should do. But I am the token American, right? He's Canadian, so don't be fooled.
I'm like serial killers. We're everywhere.
Yeah. Right, and we're the Pollyannish optimists at all times. So I'm always here to bring the positive story. So I think it's to follow on this point. Obviously, there are the dangers. There is the dark side. There are the bad things happening. But there are these examples of good happening in the world. And when it comes to women and minorities and underrepresented voices, what you're seeing is this these media, as giving voice to people who have not had voices before, giving them outlets and places to talk, giving them ways of being represented. I'm thinking most recently now in the United States of the Black Lives Matter hashtag, where, of course, recent Pew survey results show that among internet users, African Americans are more than twice as likely to use Twitter and more than 3 times as likely to be posting on Twitter on a daily basis. And so Black Lives Matter becomes a hashtag, and now as a result, police racism and police reform becomes front and center on the national agenda in the United States. And I think that is not an accident. That this is a medium that is as against the traditional gatekeepers, many of whom are, well, shall we say, white and male. They are finding a way to give expression to their to new issues and to become part of the public discourse in new ways. But also the same, to be fair, the same white male gatekeepers are also finding new and interesting outlets and innovative ways of bringing content from new voices and new people. So I think it is both things at the same time, but giving voice in many ways to people who haven't had a voice before, and that includes women among them.
Cory.
I think that it's important to remember that deviant is not the same thing as bad. And spaces in which people can be socially deviant are how behaviors become socially normed. And on the one hand, we worry about it because we worry about pro-ana becoming norming anorexia. But on the other hand, if you think about changes in rules about equal marriage, the way that equal marriage arose was because people could, outside of the remit of the state and outside of the perfect enforcement ability of the state, practice an illegal behavior that was judged immoral and corrosive until social acceptance was won, right? And one of the things that you get in spaces that can't be regulated or that are difficult to regulate is a space in which deviance can progress towards normalness, for good and for bad. And unless you think that your grandchildren will look back on 2015 and say, tell me, Gramps, how did you have it so right in 2015 that none of our social attitudes have changed? You have to anticipate that there's something that we're doing today that our descendants will view as barbaric in its restriction. And the only way that that is going to come to light is if there are spaces in which people can perform deviance without automatic enforcement.
This is a question to all of you. Do you think that we spend too much time in this world? What Susan Greenfield, Baroness Greenfield, a scientist also here, suggests is a two-dimensional world compared to the wonderful, colourful 3D world of our lives. Beeban, do you think we spend too much time? Do you think we're getting overloaded, too overstimulated?
I think there's an opportunity cost, yeah? And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and it's very attractive, so it's much easier, you know, for me to find out whether I'm posh on BuzzFeed than it is to read a big report on HS2, you know, and you could say that's a better outcome for me. But, you know, so I think there's an opportunity cost. But I don't think it's bad to spend time online. It's simply a question of how you expend it. And I would like to answer the question about women. I think it's bad for body image, and I think it's really, really bad for learning about sex, and particularly outcomes for teenage girls and boys, but primarily girls. I don't think it's bad for women as such, and definitely we want more women in tech. That's a separate issue.
Go ahead.
I certainly felt that I was spending far too much time online researching my book. And I was getting very, very depressed. And it wasn't just because I was looking at pro-Anna sites and neo-Nazis and internet trolls. Partly, that was very, very exciting. It was thrilling. It was terrifying. But it was very stimulating. And then actually things in the real world started to become a little bit drab by comparison. And I realised that was part of the problem. That I was constant, and I know my story is a particularly negative one because of the research I've done, and that's what I'm here to talk about. But I ended up finding that, you know, I was always looking for the next exciting thrill because I've been so stimulated by all of this stuff that the offline world was coming to appear rather dull.
Cory, what's the longest time you've spent off the web, away from?
My friend Paul on the front row just started giggling. Not very long.
5 minutes, 10
Must be
minutes.
said. No, I mean, that's why they made transatlantic air voyages.
All right.
Is to give me 12-hour periods in which I don't access the internet. But, you know, it would be amazing if using the internet didn't change your brain, because you only have one thing you think with, which is your brain, and using it changes it. And so climbing stairs changes your brain. It would be remarkable if using the internet didn't change your brain in some way. But, and it's also true that our brains are finite, right? We can only pay so much attention to so many things. And so it's also true that you're right, there's an opportunity cost. When you pay attention to some things, you can't pay attention to others. And also the things that are novel can be quite compelling. But I want to bring back regression to the mean, right? Like, I think one of the reasons that it feels like the internet keeps getting more compelling is because we're in an arms race between our cognitive self-defense mechanism and firms that would like to command our attention, right? The reason things changed, the reason we're not still doing Friendster, the reason it's not still Usenet, is because we had to come up with more compelling offerings because people ceased to be quite so interested in the old ways. Not everybody. We have a normal distribution of cognitive capacity and preference, but the first, you know, the first two sigmas sort of wandered off and into something more interesting.
Look, I want to open this out to the audience. Has anyone got any questions quickly here? Anyone signal if you have, and then we can get a mic to you. It's a broad subject. So, Dan, what about Dan here in the front row? You mean his mic super fast down front? Who's spoken in one of the previous sessions.
But I just want maybe just say something about the neurobiology. I think Cory's right that, you know, people have been writing letters to each other in the time of John Keats, there were 3 posts a day, and that got people into all kinds of trouble and dangerous liaisons as a suicide as a result of social interaction. So it's nothing new in that. Robin Dunbar has done some very interesting stuff about the evolution of the frontal cortex, the bit of the brain that sort of exploded around the time that language evolved and tool use evolved and social networks were developed. And it seems that about 120 is the number of people that you can keep track of, whether you're in a cave, in a village, or online. And so while Cory's right that clearly our brains are changed by all of our experiences, there's no evidence yet, Pache, Susan, Greenfield, that a fundamental shift is happening in our brains, and the number of people we can keep track of, what our social network is cognitively, seems to be fairly fixed. So I think we may be overcooking the fundamental brain change stuff.
Beeban, what about the children you filmed? They surely... Was there any substantial change in their behaviour, or do you, just was it surface behaviour, or do you think was there any kind of deeper change?
I think there was a lot of compulsive use, and that actually that the big thing for them was sort of the reward technologies, the stuff that is deliberately there to extend use was the biggest problem for them. And it didn't really matter whether it was texting, I'm in Starbucks, or watching porn, or, or actually going back to a pro-ana site. It was the inability to actually turn it off that they struggled with the most.
Well, what about the idea that they have now to kind of put themselves out in the market as a sort of little brand? We all do that to an extent. Is that a problem when children are growing up?
Kids have always done that. It's a much bigger room. You only used to be queen of your class, and now you have to be queen of a bigger group. It's a tough gig.
It's more competitive. Are they more likely to be burned by this experience, or is it really just elderly people fussing about it?
I think we're fussing a bit too much about the content and not enough about the structure, so that actually we should concern ourselves more about these issues of extended use, compulsive use, how to get off, how to sleep, the statistics on kids coming into school without, missing food, missing sleep, missing things. It's big stuff, it's changing stuff. So I think we should be more concerned about that and a little bit less concerned about some of the content issues that we seem to get a bit hysterical about.
What about the vanity that both adults and children are exhibiting? Do you think anything about that? But it seems to me that we are all these little brands, Twitter brands or whatever it is, and there is a sort of ridiculous vanity about it, is there not? Or do you find it perfectly acceptable, normal behaviour? For me, it seems extraordinary that people care so much and want to display so much.
But people are.
They want to display so much of their lives, There is a kind of sort of obsessive look-at-me quality to the web, which... Is that healthy?
Sure. Well, some people call it narcissism, some people call it transparency, and it has different boundaries, I think, for different people, and that kind of sharing, look, I have a friend who some of us share in common who is a self-confessed oversharer on the web, but he tends to share about his medical conditions, he shares about the travails that he's going through, and that has a lot of positive social benefit for some people. In other words, that level of sharing about his experience, that's at the root of services like Patients Like Me, the participatory medicine movement, the idea that the greatest healing, and this is scientifically proven, is going to come not simply from the know-how you get from the doctor, but the know-how that you get from other patients and other sufferers. Yeah. So when people are willing to put themselves out there in different ways by sharing the experiences that they've been through, it can have greatly beneficial social effects for people. At the same time, it may not be your vacation photos that I so much want to see, or know on Twitter what you ate for breakfast, but I may actually want to hear about your experience dealing with your school and your local community, or maybe I want to hear about the disease, or maybe I want to know about the doctor you went to and whether his or her bedside manner was good or bad. So that sharing is what is at the root of the web and what's good about it. And so if it weren't for that kind of sharing, we wouldn't have people and that innate sort of drive towards collaboration that Cory talked about, that we wouldn't have people getting online and crowdsourcing solutions to problems. It's why you have, the day after the Haiti earthquake, hundreds of volunteers going online to try to map where the healthcare centers are and doing that job, which would otherwise take years to do if done by one person, done in 24 hours. And we're seeing that again in crisis after crisis, where people are willing to give of their time, give of their know-how, and share of their personal experiences very much for the benefit of others. So I think it's the minority of the content that we're seeing that is the narcissistic what I ate for breakfast stuff, which is, one person's breakfast is another person's treasure. So
we got to fold them over.
Can I
Just
speak
give it
very briefly in defense of narcissism, but not narcissism. I think that oftentimes when something seems narcissistic or unimportant, it's because we're not the intended audience, right? If all of those important messages that we all agree the web should be there for, it's cancer, it's not cancer, I got the job, I didn't get the job, she survived, she died, those messages are only significant because they exist in a kind of soup whose base is made up of all of the seemingly insignificant moments that bind us together socially. So, you know, when my wife gets up in the morning and I ask how she slept, it's not because I don't know, because we sleep next to each other, right? It's like the world's easiest to decipher crypto. It just means, like, how are you, I love you, I'm thinking about you, right? And so if it seems trivial to you, perhaps it wasn't intended for you.
Yeah, I get it.
It is often said that people aren't as happy as they appear on Facebook, nor are they as angry as they appear on Twitter. And we are performing. We are performing to certain types of audiences, like now, and sometimes those audiences that we are performing to, for example, in the pro-ana communities, are very, very destructive and dangerous ones, but we get sucked into the performance of being part of that community, and as I said, for some people, that radically changes how they behave.
That's really interesting. Very good point to end on. Unless we have just one question. Let's get the mic. Let's move with the mic. Here we go. The lady in the front with the blue.
Would like to ask a question?
Be nice to have a question.
Hi. I would just be interested in how many personas each of the panel members has online. I have 2 Twitter feeds. One is my more normal one, and one is where I'm less favourable in my opinions. Oh. And that's probably because I'm not brave enough to combine the two, but I was interested in whether the panel had something similar.
Well, I'll start with me. 1.
Well, while researching my book, about 500, but now really only 1.
So I used to have a very active avatar in Second Life and avatars in other virtual worlds when one spent time in them. And now I have my own Twitter feed, and I confess that I sometimes tweet for my kid.
I mean, I have different auctorial voices. There's the voice I use when I'm writing fiction and nonfiction, writing for The Guardian and writing for Electronic Frontier Foundation. Those are all different voices, and they reflect different aspects of who I am. And in terms of how many personas I have overall, well, it's sort of 1 per email correspondent, really, which is my major way of communicating with people, because I certainly don't talk to my gran the way I talk to my friends. And so, of course, I have different personas and different facets of my identity that I reflect. The great advantage for me of using email rather than Facebook is there's no puppeteer at the helm of email who's got an ideological commitment to collapsing all the facets of your identity into one on the grounds that if you have more than one facet, you are two-faced, which is, you know, a sociopathic view of the human condition, and one of the great reasons to just
the great thing about life
not use Facebook.
How many?
I started off with half a dozen, and the more I learnt about the net, the less I have. So now I have none. No public ones.
Really, none? Not even Twitter?
No, nothing.
Commendable. Anyway, thank you very much. It was brilliant.